let's go back in time to being a son in your own family with your own father. Talk about any wounds that may have been in your life from your relationship with him, if you can condense it to a word, a phrase, and then talk about how that affected the way you related to your wife.
Just, I guess, a mini discourse here. One of the things that God has really helped me see over the course of the last probably 10 or so years is to realize the truth of the fact that because we are all broken people as sons and as fathers, that to some degree or another we are all wounded and we have all wounded. And this idea, I hate it as a father, because when I think my own kids, I hate the idea that at some level I'm going to wound my kids. But as I've come to realize that the truth of the matter is that there is, at some degree, some wound that has taken place in my life as a result of my relationship with my dad. And that's hard because, first of all, a lot of you know my dad. He spent a lot of time in this church. A lot of you have said to me over the years how much of an impact my dad has made in your life. And so sitting before you this morning and talking about my father wound, there's a fine line a little bit there, because I want to obey the fifth commandment and honor my dad. At the same time, there's a real truth to the fact that if we've all been wounded to some degree or another, we need to take some time to look back and see what it is in our past that is affecting us today. Not so that we can be a victim and blame what's happened in the past. And when we talk about father wounds, it's not to say, hey, it's my dad's fault that I'm a certain way, or it's my dad's fault that I do the things that I do. But if we don't look back and we don't see how those relationships with our dad is affecting who we are today, we can't change those things. So we cannot change what we do not understand. And so God really took me on a journey a while back to really understand how some of those things that growing up in relationship to my dad has affected who I am today. I would tell you that my dad is a great man, and if I could be half the man that my dad is by the time that I get to his age, I'll be a lucky man. But at the same time, he's not a perfect guy. And there were things that took place in my past, and without going into a lot of detail, I'd say that really there's two things that kind of came out of just a pattern of relating with my dad growing up. And the two things were this. The first is that really when it kind of comes down to it, I'm really kind of on my own. That when it comes to processing life, to understanding life, understanding the struggles of life, that I'm really kind of on my own. I really need to figure that out by myself. And then the second thing would be that I couldn't rock the boat. I couldn't. I had to keep it together. I had to make sure that that any kind of things going on in my life, that I kept that to myself, and that just don't rock the boat. If there's things going on, just kind of keep that to yourself and work that out on your own. And so the way that those two things, and there's other things that also play into it, but the way then that those two things have kind of impacted my life today, and in particular, as you've asked, relationship to my wife, I'd say that those two things kind of, again, come in, particularly in terms of the whole idea of not rocking the boat, not, making sure that I keep things all together. Need to make sure that, that I kind of keep that conflict at bay, that just want to keep things nice and even-keeled. Don't disrupt the status quo. Make sure that things are nice and smooth, and think something's bothering you, figure that out on your own.
What's your greatest struggle as a father right now?
It's just nuances of the same struggle. It's that, for me, it's striking that balance between recognizing that when God made me a father and placed kids in my life, that it wasn't because he needed me to be, this perfect dad in order to raise these kids. And so striking this balance between realizing that God really is the ultimate father to my kids, and it's going to be up to him and their response to God as to whether or not my kids are going to turn out well. But at the same time, I have a very real responsibility as a dad, and in that role that he's placed me, to be everything that I can be as his representative in my family. And so where in that balance of leaving the results of my kids turning out the way I hope and dream up to God, and still living out my role as dad, in that balance, my tendency is to kind of go to that side of wanting to take on more of the responsibility of saying, my kids turn out a certain way, it's because I got to come through in a certain way as dad. And so my biggest struggle is probably taking on too much of the responsibility in terms of the outcome. So when I see my kids and doing things that I think, I didn't teach you that. I mean, come on, we've talked about this a million times. Don't do it that way. And then they do it. My first thing is, man, I'm failing as a dad. I need to do something different. What can I do? What can I say? And then a lot of times that comes out in anger too. Just, hey, I didn't tell you to do that. I said, do it this other way, and you're doing it that way. Now it ticks me off. And unfortunately, that comes out not very good.
Dan, what if there are children here who really don't like their dads at all, and perhaps now for good reasons, and they've tuned you guys out so far, but now they're tuned in because I'm talking about them? What would you say to them?
The first is this perspective that in a lot of ways, I know for a lot of us, we have made our dads into saviors. And what I've come to realize over the years is that dads make really lousy saviors. This idea that my dad is going to come through for me and he's going to be everything that I need him to be, isn't going to work. And we're going to be sorely disappointed. At the same time, we also realize that because of that, then dads are, in this whole idea of woundedness, the first step is always forgiveness. Dan talked about that. God showed me something a couple of years ago that was really helpful to me. It comes out of Hebrews 12. There's a section of Hebrews 12 where God talks about his relationship to us as sons. And there's this verse in there tucked away that God makes a statement to us where he says that our parents, our fathers, disciplined us as they saw fit or as they thought was right. And it helped me to realize at some point that very rarely did dads get up on a daily basis and look at us as their kids and say, you know what, I wonder how I can really wound my kids today. I mean, rarely did dads get up and think to themselves, I really want to figure out a way that I can really hurt my kids today. Now, that doesn't mean that they did a good job of parenting us, or that what they decided was fit was actually what was good for us. But to realize that they had their own issues, they were working through their own wounds, they had their own things that were playing into their own lives, that has really helped me in some ways to be able to really be freed up to forgive my dad. Because there was a point in time when, as I really began to feel this woundedness with my dad, that I could really begin to feel that it was holding me back. That there was some things in my life where I just could not take the next step forward until I had addressed this whole idea of this father wound. And so sitting across the table with my dad and asking, extending forgiveness to him, whether he asked for it or not, and saying, Dad, this is a reality of how I stand today before you as a son as a result of the woundedness in my life, and sitting across the table with him and say, Dad, I just want you to know that I forgive you. In that moment, there was a major lifting that took place. There was a major shift, just even in our relationship as how we related to each other. And that whole forgiveness thing was great. But one thing that came out of that I'll never forget is not as a way of making an excuse or excusing himself or in any way diminishing that woundedness. He began to share with me, really for the first time, some of his own struggles. Some of the ways that he had been wounded by his own dad, and begin to realize, really for the first time, that he did the best he could, that he had parented the way that he thought best, but in spite of that, it still resulted in a wound. Now realizing also at the same time that even though, like I say, most dads don't get up on a daily basis and say, how can I wound my dad? Realizing that particularly in a group this big, that there probably are dads who did. There probably were dads who did get up and were vicious, who were just plain evil. And even though forgiveness still needs to be a part of that, there's really another releasing piece to that where you really release your dad because God is just, and there will be justice at some point. So those would be the things that I'd say.
Dan, the title of our message today is What is a Father? Can you answer that question?
I'd say kind of coming out of Genesis in terms of the mandate that we've been given as dads, this idea to create and cultivate. And practically, I mean, Matt and Dan have done a good job of talking about that, but just from a practical perspective, I'd say there's really 4 things that I really try to look at to try to help shape what I then do as a result of what you're talking about. The first thing I'd say is be really careful about my time. This whole idea, this fallacy that our culture has placed on us that we can make up with quality time the lack of quantities of time. So we have this idea that, well, I may not be around much as a dad, but I'll just make up for it, on the weekend or doing this special time. There's nothing that substitutes for time. And so to try to make sure that my time is spent in the context of my family, they are my first priority. Make sure that I do that. Second is to create a compelling vision of gender for them. So with my boys, that they grow up understanding who God's made them as men and what then how they are to live that out. And then with my daughter, how God's created her as a woman and how then she needs to live that out. Model a code of conduct. So, hey, who are we to be? Don't just talk about it, but model that. What does that look like? So how do I treat my wife? Speaks volumes to my daughter about what femininity is all about and what to look for in a man. How I live as a man with relationship to my kids and my friends and my work speaks volumes to my sons about what it means to be a man. And then finally is just to be a spiritual force in my home. That when it comes down to it, the spiritual, how my family and how my home is from a spiritual basis is due to me, and how do I then bring that and inject that into my home. So really those 4 things: my time, imparting a vision for gender, living out, modeling a code of conduct, and then being a spiritual force in my home.
Okay, Dan, how has God fathered you?
That a lot of it has to do with the verse where it talks, I think it's in Romans, about the fact that that God is our daddy. This idea of Abba, Father, that it's really the word, the term that says that God is our daddy. He's not this father that is somewhere up there. He is our present daddy. And I didn't really get that, and I don't think you really can get that until you are a dad yourself. And you begin to think in terms of my own kids and how much I desire for my own kids, and realize that at an infinitely larger scale, that's how God thinks about me. And so practically when I come into situations, whether it's at work or in my home or wherever it is, and I think about if my kids were in this situation and I could be right there with them, what would I do? So you're going into a difficult situation at work, in a meeting that you're going to face somebody that you don't particularly like, and you're a little bit fearful about what they're going to say. And I think, hey, my kids, if they were going into that, or if my earthly father was right there next to me, I'm going into that, and he was right there with me, there would be that sense of, you know what, this is okay because, man, my dad's right here. Nobody can do anything. My dad's right here. My kids, when they go into a difficult situation, they can be very fearful. You ask them to go into the gas station, say to them, hey, I'm on crutches. Will you go in and pay for gas while I do this? And they look at you like, you're going to ask me to do what? Go in and pay? Oh, okay, I'll go with you. Oh, you'll go with me. I can do anything. All right, my dad's going to be right there with me. And so that's one of the ways that I feel like God has really fathered me, is to get me to shift my thinking in terms of God being my father up there to being my daddy right next to me.